I'm Kevin Keene of Keene Mass Appraisal Consulting. In April of 2024, I was commissioned to run an assessment equity study for Buncombe County, North Carolina. This presentation summarizes the findings that I presented in a detailed and extensive report. The report is available through the Buncombe County website and also on my website, keenemac.com. I was contracted to address this problem. There is a perception that Buncombe County currently overassesses poor people and communities of color. In addition, there is also a perception that the county underassesses wealthy, primarily white communities. From where does this perception originate, and what does it mean for the assessor's office? I approached this problem in 3 steps. The first step was to properly define the problem. There has been a lot of discussion about equity in assessments. Much of it does not focus on assessments, but includes other social and economic issues that serve to confuse the matter. The second step was to conduct meaningful analysis. A lot of analysis has been done on this topic, but is it truly meaningful? I've seen a lot of mishandled data and heard many false equivalencies and unsupported conclusions throughout these discussions. The third step is to suggest actionable remedies when bias or sources of bias are found. So some context. Buncombe County is not unique in this regard. Alleging assessment bias has become a cottage industry in this country. All major cities and many counties have been the recipients of reports that allege bias in assessments. So here's Buncombe County, along with a list of probably hundreds of other counties and every major city in the country. It is important in this discussion to stay focused on assessments. It is easy to conflate assessments with taxes or to assume that bias in the local pricing structure is causally related to bias in assessments. Here are some examples that are commonly drawn into the conversation. Redlining is the practice of discriminate lending that excludes neighborhoods that are considered undesirable. Making mortgages unattainable in communities of color or poor communities contributes to the inability of persons in those communities to accumulate wealth. This is an example of the redlining map for the city of Asheville. And there's no doubt that redlining has historically served to disenfranchise people in Buncombe County. But the question is, what role, if any, does it play in the current assessment process? Predatory speculation occurs when cash buyers offer people who may not know the true value of their property easy money for their homes. It frequently occurs in poor communities or communities of color. Restrictive covenants are clauses that are written into the deeds to prevent the sale or rental of properties to minorities. They are not uncommon in communities across the nation. Racial deed restrictions became common after 1926 when the U.S. Supreme Court validated their use. Any owner who violated them risked forfeiture of their property. Governmental actions have also served to create inequity in housing markets. These actions include using eminent domain to demolish communities of color for public works. This map shows 2 freeways that were built in Detroit that served to isolate or demolish primarily black-owned business and entertainment districts. Other examples include not building sewers or infrastructure to deliver clean water or waste removal to certain communities. Appraisal bias. There have been several recently documented cases of bias in the fee appraisal industry. In these cases, a black family has received an appraisal with what appears to be a very low estimate of value. After removing all evidence, including pictures, artwork, etc., of their ownership from the home, and getting a white family to stand in for them to meet another appraiser, these same families received much higher estimates of value. So what do all of these examples have in common? Well, none of them are about assessments. We need to stay tightly focused on the issues that involve mass appraisal. Assessors are not typically responsible for the dynamics of the local pricing structure. They do not determine taxes or create tax policy. They do not set tax rates. Their function is to estimate market values. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter why people pay what they pay for housing, only that assessors estimate values without favoring one group over another. So what is equity? Equity, as defined by the dictionary, is the quality of being fair and impartial. But in this discussion, we need to go further. In assessment, we consider equity to be a state wherein a group of properties that share a given set of attributes have similar values for tax purposes. From a racial or social perspective, there should be no discernible systemic bias in the valuation process or in the resulting set of appraisals based on race, ethnicity, religion, income, age, or other demographic stratification. So I'd like to make a distinction between equality and equity. With equality, everyone gets the same thing. In this illustration, everyone gets the same size box to help them reach the books on the top shelf. If we seek to correct an imbalance that creates a disadvantage for a certain group, equality often does not solve the problem. In fact, it sometimes makes the problem measurably worse. With equity, however, everyone gets what they need so that a common goal, in this case reaching the top shelf, can be achieved. I believe that the assessor is uniquely positioned to provide equity. From a systems perspective, equality is about process, whereas equity is about outcome. Assessors have access to the best data, possess the best domain knowledge, and understand the history of valuation in their jurisdictions. Courts, on the other hand, tend to produce equality. How many times have we heard the phrase equal under the law and witnessed the inequity that results? For this reason, I suggest that the assessor's office is the best party to proactively identify, isolate, and correct systemic bias in assessments. To understand this issue, I found it helpful to use a visual aid. In fact, I really could not understand the problem until I created a visualization. I'm going to walk through my visual representation of the problem that there is a general perception that property assessments are biased against communities of color and poor people. It is possible that the perception is the problem, not the underlying truth. In the face of a strong perception, the truth of the matter may become irrelevant. Assessments can be either biased or unbiased. There are industry benchmarks for the level of assessment and the relative uniformity of assessments. Ideally, predicted market value should closely replicate observed sale prices, with little variation in the degree to which these values are related to price. Assessments are considered to be unbiased if measures of uniformity are consistent throughout the universe of sales data, and if residuals, which is the difference between the predicted price and the observed price, otherwise known as errors, are randomly distributed. Assessments may be considered biased if errors are not randomly distributed or can be correlated with specific locations, high or low prices, or shown to clearly favor one subset of properties over another. It is a practical impossibility to achieve a perfectly distributed set of assessments. However, those that fall within recognized industry standards can be considered to be unbiased. Assessments are the result of a valuation process, and there are many, many different valuation processes. Every county or municipality will create a unique valuation process. However, all valuation processes will have certain elements or subsystems in common. Some typically include data collection and gathering, which leads to databases of property data. Sales validation, which determines the sales that are indicators of value of similar properties, and also captures attributes of properties at the time of sale and leads to databases of sales data. Sales and property data may be used to create neighborhood and location definitions. These should not be based on demographic data. Some municipalities use census tracts, zip codes, or voting districts to delineate neighborhoods. If so, the results will almost certainly be biased along demographic lines. because zip code, census tracts, and voting districts are rooted in demographics. Buncombe County uses a custom-defined set of location definitions that do not use demographic data. Modeling is the logic and mathematics to convert sales, income, cost, and property data into predictions of value. For purposes of this discussion, a model is any repeatable process that results in a value prediction. Review and oversight includes examining the values produced by the model or by the valuation process and making corrections or revisions, as well as resolving complaints and informal or formal appeals by property owners. The results of the valuation process are applied to all properties, including both sold and those that did not sell. In Buncombe County, typically between 4% and 6% of the properties are sold each year, leaving the vast majority of properties in the unsold property group. Sales are never evenly distributed, so there may be properties that are not directly represented by sales. This leaves plenty of room for assumptions that may lead to errors. One group of 10 sales might represent a group of 300 similar properties. Another group of 10 sales might represent only 50 properties. So the magnitude of errors can be greatly affected by the representative relationship between sold and unsold properties. Now, if assessments are unbiased, the pool of overassessed properties will be small and randomly distributed, so that many homeowners in this group may not be aware that they are overassessed. The pool of underassessed homeowners will also be small and randomly distributed. In my experience, many of these homeowners will know that they are underassessed, but will not complain. The large pool of accurately and fairly assessed homeowners will typically go about their lives without any feeling at all about their property assessments. The municipality will be satisfied because very few people are complaining. Most assessment offices exist within the political framework of the county or municipality and do not operate in a vacuum. If there is direct political interference in the valuation process, assessments will necessarily be biased. Political interference may be overt or subtle, but can also be benign or well-intentioned. So if assessments are biased, there will be larger pools of both overassessed and underassessed properties, and the effects will not be randomly distributed. There will be clear winners and losers. The winners may be quite happy. The losers will be unhappy. The municipality or county should be unhappy as well. Each of these subsystems and processes is driven by humans, and humans have biases. There are opportunities for bias to be introduced through any of these subsystems, and if even one of them taints the valuation process with bias, the resulting assessments may also be biased. Every one of these subsystems or processes must be without bias in order for the assessments to be unbiased. So viewed from this perspective, it is easy to understand how difficult it is to produce a set of unbiased assessments. The deck is really stacked against the assessment office. So how do we determine if assessments are biased or unbiased? We typically conduct a ratio study, which is a statistical process that compares the level of assessment and uniformity to observed sales prices across neighborhoods, types of buildings, price levels, or other ways to stratify properties. A serious limitation is that ratio studies can only be run against the file of sold properties. They tell us little or nothing about the large pool of unsold properties. Also consider that in most ratio studies, each sale carries equal weight, so the degree to which a sale represents a greater or lesser number of unsold properties is not recognized. How does the perception of bias arise? This usually involves an outside analyst who is often an academic, a community activist, or someone hired by a special interest group. They have credentials and a willing audience. They conclude that assessments are systemically biased. They come to this conclusion by conducting a ratio study, similar to that of the assessor's office, but with one critical difference. They are often using publicly available data, which includes sales data that has not been vetted to remove transactions that do not meet prescribed tests for being indicators of typical market activity and are not useful predictors of the prices of similar properties. And they do not have access to the vetted data of the assessor's office. They are also using only current property data, both physical attributes and market values, not data that describes the conditions that were present at the time of sale. For example, the file includes a sale from 2021 for a property in poor condition, which sold for $100,000. But the property has been subsequently rehabbed or renovated and has a current value of $200,000. In their data file, it shows that the property is a rehab with a value of $200,000 and a sale price of $100,000. From their perspective, it looks like the property is significantly overvalued. In the assessor's data file, the sale price for $100,000 is for a poor condition property, for which the prediction of value might have been $102,000. So the problem is that even though the analyst's analysis is correct, the data itself is flawed. Additionally, the analyst is not familiar with the dynamics of the local housing market and therefore does not recognize the noise that is inherent in any market. The entire appraisal industry is predicated on the premise that the value of a property is linked to its attributes, that the value of a property can be predicted if the attributes of the property are known and can be compared to the attributes of similar properties that have sold. If I know the attributes of a property, I can predict the value. Are there cases where prices are not as dependent on attributes as they are on other factors that may not relate to the property at all? What happens when the relationship between price and attributes is broken? When observed prices are not based on the attributes of the property, variance from predictable prices arises, which cannot be explained. So consider how often identical properties next door to one another sell at the same time, but at different prices. The difference may be explained by the relative negotiating skills of the buyers and sellers, something that can never be captured in any of the data files. Even if the attributes were in the data, they might appear so infrequently that it would be statistically insignificant. The relationship between price and attributes tends to break down with greater frequency in the low end and high end of the price spectrum. A greater percentage of sales in the low end and high end price ranges should therefore be invalidated in the vetting process. This analyst is usually aware of bias in the local housing market. Redlining, restrictive deed covenants, predatory speculation, all those things that we discussed earlier, and assumes that those biases have a causal relationship with assessments. The analyst examines the results of the flawed ratio study by incorporating demographic data into the analysis. Demographic data such as ethnicity, income, age, levels of education should have no place in the valuation process. Considering that much of the noise in the market occurs in communities of color and in poor neighborhoods, cross-correlation of ratios with demographic data further distorts the emerging picture. Even so, the assessor's office must be prepared to examine performance through the lenses of demographics if the arguments are to be countered. This can be tricky, as it is easy to confuse correlation with causality. So all of this converges to create a very strong perception, seemingly based in fact, that assessments are biased. Articles and reports are published and presented to the public, and this results in large groups of people who believe that they have been treated unfairly by the county or municipality. The municipality is concerned because the very real threat of a class action lawsuit could result in significant loss of revenue. Even worse, the remedy that could be imposed by a court may actually fail to resolve the problem. The cure could be worse than the disease. In addition to conducting ratio studies to examine the health of assessments, there are other meaningful analyses that need to be performed. And this is a space where innovation is needed. The assessment industry needs to go beyond analysis of the relationship between sales and market values, and consider activity levels, representation of unsold properties, comparative market values and market value rates, and other measures of assessment equity and performance. When we engage in the bias discussion, we should ensure that all parties in the discussion are addressing the same issues from a common perspective. Only then can we identify both the presence of bias in the evaluation process and trace any observed bias to its source so it can be remediated. Creating this diagram informed the correct question that needed to be addressed in Buncombe County. When I was presented with a report that assessments in Philadelphia were biased while I worked there, I considered all of the elements on the left side of this diagram, the evaluation processes and subsystems, without considering the most important aspects of the discussion. What was generating the perception of bias? How were qualified analysts coming to a conclusion of bias? I had to identify all of the elements on the right side of the diagram and understand the interaction between both sides of the diagram in order to frame a discussion that had any chance of allowing a rational approach to identifying and resolving the issues. When I read reports alleging assessment bias, I find that they share many problems. They frequently do not use sales data that is appropriate for this work. They use publicly available sales data, downloaded from websites or supplied by third parties. And this data includes historic sale prices, but also current attributes or market values, not what was present at the time of sale. So these analysts don't perform any significant sales validation that excludes transactions that do not represent typical market activity. So many of them, Harris School of Public Policy discloses where they get their data from. They buy it from a third party, and it says quite clearly that that this data is historic prices, not time trended, not captured attributes as of time of sale, and they're choosing and comparing them to current attributes. They don't time trend prices, or if they do time trend, they use imprecise methods to adjust prices for time. They rely almost exclusively on ratio studies, which are misleading when price and attributes or value are not connected. They don't know enough about the local markets to filter out the noise that is always present in the data. They don't consider the degree to which sales represent unsold properties. They make direct comparisons based on price or value without normalizing the data by using price or value per square foot, let's say, or other significant units of comparison. So I found that the previously published studies for Buncombe County suffer from all of these deficiencies, which to me makes them unreliable sources of information. So what was the process that I used for conducting this study? Well, the evaluation of assessment bias requires much more than merely running a ratio study. In my report, I enumerate all of the steps and processes that I used to examine assessment equity in Buncombe County. I started by driving through all 27 communities in the county to become familiar with the inventory. Of the 168 census block groups in the county, I probably got to about 150 of them. I made sure that I was using only appropriate data sources. I built regression models to isolate the effects of time, calculate nonlinear time adjustments for sale prices, and also to remove outliers from the data. I ran a ratio study that complied with the IAAO standard of disqualifying sales that do not meet the prescribed tests for being in a ratio study. I examined the representation of unsold properties and identified properties that were not represented by sales. I looked at sales disqualification rates across many different strata of the inventory. I looked at them by price, by race or income, by communities, by property types, all different ways of looking at the data. I examined each and every of the assessment subsystems to identify potential sources of bias. And that means that I interviewed the people who were actually doing the work to see if they had any bias in their approach to the work, or if there was something inherent in the process itself that would produce bias. That included examining workflows and processes to identify potential sources of bias. I looked at the distribution of assessment errors as a possible indication of bias. And finally, I made specific and actionable recommendations for improvement. One of the biggest problems that I find in doing this work is that there are unrealistic expectations of what mass appraisal is designed to achieve and what it can do. The goal isn't to get every value right, but to produce values that are uniform and fair. Mass appraisal is an exercise in estimating value by establishing one or more central tendencies and accounting for variance away from the central tendencies for various attributes that affect price. The primary goal is to produce estimates of value that are uniform and where variance can be traced back to specific attributes. Accuracy of the estimates of value are an important but secondary consideration, and this is true no matter which approach to value, sales, cost, or income is used. So at the end of the process, similar properties should have similar values, and values between dissimilar properties should be proportionately different and explainable. And it works by determining a value for a typical property and then explaining why values of other properties are different. And understand that unique or unusual properties or properties in both the very low and high end of the spectrum of price can be more difficult to value. Any application of a central tendency tends to pull the higher value properties down towards the center and raise the lower value properties up towards that same center. So therefore, there's going to be an inherent tendency to overvalue low-end properties and undervalue high-end properties. The best any mass appraisal system can hope for is to mitigate these effects, but they can never be completely eliminated. Some analysts run ratio studies and present with just normal observation of variance in the statistics as evidence of bias. But as long as the statistical measures fall within the IAAO standards, some degree of variance is normal, and lower or higher median ratios, CODs, and PRDs are expected. So what are some of the presumption of the appraisal industry? The entire appraisal industry is predicated on the principle that a property's value can be predicted if the attributes of the property are known and can be compared to the attributes of similar properties that have sold. But what happens when this is not true? When observed prices are not based on the attributes of the property, variance from predictable prices arises, which cannot be explained. This condition commonly exists at the low and high ends of the value spectrum. And when price classes are correlated with race or income, this normal variation can give the appearance of demographic bias. A little bit about sales data. So the assessment office has many functions. Historically, the principal one is the promotion of public records that disclose information relating to the ownership and consideration paid for every parcel in the county. Publicly available data files have traditionally been structured to support this function. These files will usually list only the most recent deed transaction for each parcel and only the most rudimentary validation, that is, if it's a sheriff's sale or a foreclosure or a sale between related parties, nominal consideration. But information that's on the face of the deed is applied. But in these days, the assessment office also bears responsibility for the mass appraisal of all properties, using a variety of methods to promote fair and equitable market values based on location and attributes of each parcel. And this requires an entirely different type of sales file, one that's going to include multiple transactions for each parcel. And all of these transactions will have been thoroughly validated to include only transactions that are useful indicators of value of similar properties and also attributes as they existed at the time of sale. So each of these files serves only the purpose for which it's intended. You need both, but one should never be used as a substitute for the other. Publicly available data files should not be used to determine the equity of assessments from any perspective, and yet many analysts use these very files to support the perception of biased assessments. At the minimum, the analyst should use the appropriate data files. The best source of properly vetted and maintained data is the assessment office. But if the analyst is alleging misconduct on the part of the assessment office, how much faith will they have in a file that the assessor gives them? Some analysts will use data files from multiple listing services or other sources that are electronically available. However, we must recognize that many transactions that occur in communities of color or economically disadvantaged communities are not represented by real estate professionals. So therefore, there's an implicit bias in using those files. Proper disqualification of transactions is critical in conducting a true ratio study. Even if the sales approach is not the primary driver of the valuation process, sales are going to be used to measure assessment performance. When a property's attributes at time of sale are principally the same at the time of valuation, there is a relationship between price and market value. But when the attributes at the time of sale and attributes at time of valuation are significantly different, the relationship no longer holds true. The price doesn't tell you what somebody paid for. The sale price now bears little or no relationship to the value. And if we're using a ratio study as part of the inequity analysis, these transactions must be identified and removed from consideration. So Section 3.5 of the Standard on Ratio Studies, published by IAAO, states that the appraiser must ascertain whether the property rights transferred, the permitted use, and the physical characteristics of the property on the date of assessment are the same as those on the date of sale. If the physical characteristics of the property have changed since the last appraisal, adjustments may be necessary before including the property in a ratio study. Properties with significant differences in these factors should be excluded from the ratio study. So this is a table that shows the percentage of transactions that are disqualified by various price classes. So Buncombe County, I created 10 price classes. The column labeled 1 are the ones that are disqualified because of the mismatch in attributes between attributes at time of sale and current attributes. The ones in the column labeled column 2 are the ones that are identified as outliers by their regression models. And both of these results need to be eliminated from the ratio study. But let's look at how many transactions are disqualified in the high end. Almost 60% of the transactions. And compare that to the relatively low number of transactions that are disqualified in the low end. And this is for mismatching attributes. And why could this be true? Well, in a high-end property, when a buyer gets up from the settlement table, they typically have resources left to make changes or improvements or alterations to the property. And they are going to alter that property to make it suit their tastes as they live in it. Whereas, in contrast, at the low end of the price spectrum, buyers are usually using up all of their sales, all their resources just to acquire the properties. And at the end of that process, they don't have money left over to make changes in the property. So they're going to live in it pretty much the way that it is. So you shouldn't expect that the same number or same percentage of properties are going to be disqualified across different spectrums of price. Now, let's look at how many transactions are disqualified as outliers. 20% in the low end compared to only 12.5% in the high end. And compare these to the other price classes where it's like 2, 3, 4%. So there's simply more non-market activity in the low and high end of price. And please be aware that this process is not subjective. These aren't decisions that an analyst makes. The disqualifiers themselves are in the data. At the bottom, if we look at the bottom of column 1, we see that 41.2% of transactions are disqualified based on attribute mismatches. Now, 40% of the data in your ratio study should be disqualified, but is not. the results of that study are bound to be distorted. So why don't more analysts adhere to the standard? I don't know. I can't answer that. So there's been a lot of talk about flattening the curve. And the curve is a graph that supposedly shows systemic overvaluation of low-end properties and undervaluation of high-end properties. If I take the Buncombe County data and follow the process used by other analysts, these are the ratio study results. Properties in the lowest price class are assessed at 93.5% of price. As price increases, the median ratio goes down until we get to the top price class, which is valued at only 76.3% of price. It looks like a real problem until I properly disqualified sales. So these are the results of the study when prices are time trended and transactions are disqualified. There is no overvaluation in low end. In fact, that's the class that has the lowest median. And there's also no undervaluation in the high end. Look at how tightly all of the price classes are grouped around 91%. The COD is also good in all classes. So there are also, if you look at the PRD and the price-related differential and the price-related bias, there are no indications of vertical inequities. So the best way to flatten the curve is for the analyst to manage the data properly. Now, talking about adjusting sales for time. If we're going to have a sufficient number of transactions to support a reasonable analysis, the analyst must often use several years of sales data. And particularly in the post-COVID era, prices must be adjusted for time to normalize data as of a common date. Accurate time trending is a process that requires extensive knowledge of local markets and submarkets. Within any jurisdiction, there are frequently multiple time trends in play. Some areas or types of property are simply hotter than others. So many analysts use consumer price indexes or housing indexes to adjust sales for time. And use of these methods result in adjustments that are linear and too broad or general to support reliable analysis. Consumer price indexes include guns, gas, butter, food, all of which change at different rates and probably not in the same direction or to the same degree as real estate. Housing indexes are often only reliable at regional levels, and they're not going to be granular enough to trend prices across submarkets. Therefore, the use of general indexes is not recommended. The most accurate method for isolating the effects of time on price is to build regression models that control for as many other elements as possible before calculating time adjustment factors that can then be applied to adjust prices for all transactions. I suspected that there were different time trends in play across the county, and therefore built 3 separate regression models for urban, suburban, and rural communities to isolate the effects of time. So these are the resulting time trends. Notice that none of them are the same, and none of them are linear. If I use a linear time trend, where I draw a straight line from the beginning point to the end point, I would be correct at the beginning and wrong at every point in between. So one time trend, especially a linear one, cannot possibly yield accurate results. So we need to recognize that there's a difference between observing isolated and unrelated instances of uneven assessment performance, or what I call anecdotal bias, and systemic bias. For systemic bias to exist, assessments for the disadvantaged class should underperform consistently in contrast to other classes. And the bias must be experienced almost universally by a demographically identifiable group. Finding one disadvantaged community that is performing inequitably is not enough to claim systemic bias. Bias against all or many such communities must be demonstrated in order to claim systemic bias. The bias has to be pervasive. Anecdotal bias is not evidence of systemic bias. So anecdotal bias may be the result of poor or uneven data quality, inadequate training for one employee or a small number of employees, or the failure to isolate the attributes or forces that create variance in local real estate markets. Not to say that anecdotal bias should not be remediated when discovered, but we must recognize that the steps that need to be taken to correct anecdotal bias are very different than those that are needed to correct systemic bias, and we need to plan accordingly. There may be bias in the local pricing structure. Pricing structures almost always contain bias. As long as the assessments consistently respond to observed prices, it does not matter why those prices exhibit patterns of bias or discrimination. So how do we conduct meaningful analysis? Understanding that your blind and fair process is producing undesirable bias is the first step in uncovering the causes of observed bias. So how can we actually determine the degree to which assessments are biased? Our way of proceeding should be with an attitude of open-minded curiosity. There should be nothing in this process that should come from a punitive or a defensive mindset. We want to use analysis to uncover the root cause or causes of bias so that remedial action can be recommended and taken. And we should be entirely objective throughout the process. If possible, a neutral third party should be used to run the analysis. One of the most insidious forms of bias is confirmation bias, which means that a person will see what they expect to see and will find the data that supports their particular point of view and ignore everything else. So traditional analysis may fall short in uncovering racial or social biases in assessments. Sales ratios can be useful, but should not be exclusively relied upon. We must be mindful of their limitations. And when properties are not directly represented by sales, as they are not in many disadvantaged communities, we may group them with other properties that appear to be similar, and this grouping may be inappropriate and may lead to errors in valuation or analysis. We need to use demographic data for the analysis. And we should also examine the distribution of assessment errors. There are always going to be errors, and you can cherry pick the data to find a property that's overvalued and compare that to a property that's undervalued. The question is, are the errors random? Or are there patterns in the errors that indicate bias? So using demographic data, it's necessary in a meaningful analysis of this type, but the assessment office is not the party that should integrate property and sales data with demographic data. Most assessment offices are subject to the Universal Standard of Professional Appraisal Practice, which prohibits the use of demographic data in appraisals. Taking raw census data as numerical values can generate results that are difficult to interpret. So it's useful to transform that data into categories or define classes that are easier to interpret. You also have to decide if it's more appropriate to define strata by absolute or relative terms. So in looking at the census data, census tracts are too large and there's too much variety within a census tract to be useful for this kind of analysis. Census blocks are typically too granular. So I chose census block groups as the best unit of comparison. Those are groups of census blocks that are related. And usually there are between 3 and 5 census block groups in a census tract. Taking raw census data as scalar or numerical values can generate results that are difficult to interpret. And we don't know who owns any specific property. The data, what the census data tells us is the number of the population that falls within specific groups. And it's useful to transform that data into categories or buckets. So we have to decide which is better, an absolute or relative term. So it makes a lot of sense to classify race in absolute terms. So everywhere I go, I use these 5 classes of race for racial classes. If you're less than 20% non-white, if you're between 20 and 40% non-white, if you're between 40 and 70% non-white, between 70 and 90% non-white, or above 90% non-white. Median income and the cost of living vary greatly from one municipality to the next. Buncombe County is not New York City or San Francisco or Boulder County or Cleveland, Ohio. So median income and cost of living are going to vary greatly, and therefore it makes more sense to look at median income from a local perspective. So calculated the median income for the county and created evenly spaced quintiles around that median income. So if I combine the race and income classes, it results in a possible 25 combinations ranging from less than 20% non-white with the lowest median income to over 90% non-white, the highest median income group. In Buncombe County, there are only 14 of these possible 25 combinations. So this map shows where the census block groups are located. The blue shaded block groups are less than 20% non-white. The yellow palette are where the population is between 20 and 40% non-white, and the rest are more than 40% non-white. There is only one block group in the 70 to 90% non-white class, and it is in northwest Buncombe. Dark blue areas on this map are the census block groups with populations that are more than 40% non-white and with median incomes of less than $62,000. For purposes of this discussion, I'm going to refer to them as disadvantaged, although that's just a label. There's really no value in calling them disadvantaged. But there are 8 such communities in the county, and within them there are about 2,450 single-family residences. So I feel like I need to emphasize this point because so few people, both in the industry and lay people, understand it. Ratio studies are commonly used to examine the relationship between sale prices and assessed values. To the degree that properties that have sold are representative of the properties that have not sold, ratio studies can provide valuable insight into the fairness and equity of all assessments within a jurisdiction. But they assume that the attributes at time of sale are equal to the attributes at time of valuation. When this is true, there is a relationship between sale price and market value. But when a property's attributes at time of sale are different than at the time of valuation, there's no longer a relationship between the price and the market value. What you paid for the property no longer represents what the property is. So how useful are ratio studies then? Well, we can make the argument that the level of assessment, which is the median ratio, comparing disadvantaged and advantaged communities, is the best objective measure of equity. The price-related bias and the price-related differential are traditional indicators of vertical equity, which means that you're valuing high-priced properties about the same as low-priced properties. They are only useful at the county-wide level, not when comparing strata, because within the strata it only tells you about properties, at the high-priced properties within the strata versus low-priced properties within the strata. So they're not really that helpful. But dispersion, which is the distance away from the central tendency or median ratio, is measured by the coefficient of dispersion. And it's less meaningful where housing stock is not homogeneous. Ratio studies can give good indications of what is happening in the middle or more typical properties, but are less informative when we get out to the edges or the non-typical parts of the inventory. And the important thing to remember is that ratio studies tell you nothing about properties that do not sell. We make the assumption that sold properties are similar to unsold properties, but this is an assumption that must be tested. So this is a chart of the change in ratio over time from 2020 to 2023. In 2020, all of the groups, except for the 40 to 70% non-white below median income group, had median ratios of between 0.95 and 1.0, which is pretty good. By 2023, prices had risen such that all groups were now between 0.6 and 0.7, or 60 and 70%, with the lone exception again being the 40 to 70% non-white group, which dropped to about 48%. So what this shows you is that within that group, the 40 to 70% non-white group, it was not overvalued as of the last reappraisal in 2021, but it did see more dramatic price increases in that group than in all others. So this year-by-year line chart by race and income shows some variance, but it does not show systemic overassessment of non-white, lower-income populations. When I adjust prices for time, this shows even less variance between classes. Almost all of them are starting out between 0.85 and 0.95%, and they do spread out a little bit, but over the 4-year price ranges, there's not that much difference between them. But they don't show systemic over or under assessment within any of those classes. So this is a map of median ratios by census block group, and it shows that almost all of the groups are undervalued currently, and that only 2 are currently slightly overvalued, and the overvaluation is not present in any of the disadvantaged communities, which is what we would see if racial or income bias were present. So it's not always clear which study is going to give you the best picture. I ran 8 sets of ratio studies for this purpose, for this report, and I used various combinations of historic price, time-adjusted prices calibrated to December of 2023, and time-adjusted prices calibrated to January of 2021, which was the date of the last reassessment. I compared those prices to current values or values predicted by a regression model. And I used either all transactions or I disqualified transactions as previously discussed. So the most useful of these sets turned out to be set number 6, which used current values and prices calibrated to the date of last assessment, that is January of 2021, and disqualifying sales as per the IAAO standard. So all of the following slides are based on that study. I've already talked about the ratio statistics from that study by price class, which showed that there was some variance, but no indicators of systemic bias in the median ratios, excellent CODs in all price classes, and no evidence of systemic vertical inequity. This map shows the distribution of price classes across the county. There are some concentrations of high prices, but in general, prices are well dispersed across many communities. These are the ratio results by those 27 communities. The ratio results by community show that the highest levels of assessment are not in the predominantly non-white communities, but in Montford, Weaverville, East Asheville, and East Buncombe. Coefficient of dispersion is within IAAO tolerance everywhere, although Broad River and Sandy Mush show the poorest uniformity. Now, this is not surprising considering the wide variety of properties found there. Overall, there is no indication of vertical inequity. So I would suggest pausing the video if you want to read more into this chart. So now that we've looked at some baseline by looking at various strata, we've looked at it by price class, by communities, by some other strata, we've established some baselines. So now these are the results by race class. So you'll note that the 70 to 90% non-white group actually had the lowest median ratio, and that the coefficient of dispersion is pretty close for all classes. When I look at it by median income, still the median ratios are very close for all classes, and the COD, or coefficient of dispersion, is close for all classes. If I take those 8 disadvantaged communities and compare them to the non-disadvantaged communities, again, no indications of bias. And when I combine race and income, nothing really stands out except that the lowest median is in the greatest percentage non-white group. Coefficient of dispersion shows some normal variance, but certainly not systemic bias. So there is nothing in this data that suggests bias in terms of race or income. Another way to look for bias is to examine the distribution of ratios. So I've divided ratios into 5 classes, ranging class 1, which is the most severely undervalued, to class 5, which is the most overvalued. And this map shows the ratio class for each sale and helps to visualize the distribution of errors. This map shows that most of the county is undervalued, and there is no dominant geographic pattern of overvaluation in the disadvantaged communities. If there were demographic bias, overvalued properties would be concentrated in the disadvantaged communities, and the most undervalued properties would be in the mostly white, high-income census block groups. So here's a false map, just to show you what it would look like. So this is what it would look like if you actually had bias. You would see the red shades are the highest, are the most overvalued properties, and you would see these concentrated in the disadvantaged neighborhoods. And all the blue shades are, the dark blue ones are the most undervalued, and you would see those concentrated mostly in the predominantly wealthy white neighborhoods. This is not what we see. Yet another way to examine the distribution of assessment errors is through the use of normalized probability plots. 45-degree fit line is where errors are completely random. You can see all the plotted points here. This is the probability plot for the entire county. When the plots all fall close to the line, this shows that your errors are mostly randomly distributed. This is the probability plot for the non-disadvantaged communities. You can see how close it is to the overall plot for the county. And this is the probability plot for the disadvantaged communities. Again, all of the points are fairly close to the line, which indicates that your errors are random. Now, by contrast, this is the probability plot if I do not manage my data correctly, if I do what other analysts have done. This is without disqualifying sales or adjusting prices for time. And this clearly shows patterns to the error distribution in both the low and higher price properties. Another way to examine errors is through the use of this kind of scatter plot. In this scatter plot, each point represents a transaction where the time-adjusted price intersects with the current value. Points, as we can see, all the points are fairly close to the fit line throughout the entire price spectrum, with points of all colors both above and below the fit line. If there were systemic bias, most or all points of one color would either be above or below the line, not distributed on both sides of the line as we see here. The fall off below the line in the high end to the right is a very typical pattern, because what's happening there is that people are paying premiums for higher end properties that cannot be explained. So by contrast, this scatter plot clearly shows systemic bias or systemic overvaluation of lower priced properties and undervaluation of higher priced properties. Notice how most of the points in the low priced properties are above the fit line. As price increases, most of the points fall below the line. Now, this is not Buncombe County data. This is just what systemic bias would look like if it were present. So another way to look at the assessment error distribution is through tabular data. So this table shows the number and percentage of sales in each ratio class by the combination of race and income. So you can see that the highest rates of overvaluation are not in the highest non-white or lowest income groups, which is the pattern that would be seen if there were systemic bias. So another thing that we can do is we can plot assessment errors on maps to reveal patterns of bias. With no bias, errors are going to be randomly distributed across all neighborhoods. If there are bias, again, this is a false map. This is not the actual Buncombe County data. This just shows you can see where the errors are clustered in all of the disadvantaged neighborhoods, which are circled on the map. So my conclusions after running all of these ratio studies, adjusting prices for time and removing outliers, the ratio study for the current set of assessments, which is current value and price calibrated as of January of 2021, shows, well, the level of assessment is low for all groups of properties when stratifying by price class, community, race, and/or income class. There are no strata that are overvalued, although disadvantaged communities are slightly more undervalued than other communities. Wealthy, mostly white communities are not assessed at lower levels than other communities. There is no overall indication of vertical inequity as measured by either the price-related bias or the price-related differential. Horizontal equity, as measured by the coefficient of dispersion, is good for all strata. No strata fall outside of the IAAO performance standard. Errors are randomly distributed and do not indicate systemic bias. Prices are rising at higher rates in non-white, lower-income communities. This may be indicative of the effects of gentrification in those communities. Overall, there are normal degrees of variance across various strata. So now I want to talk about representation. So in order to examine representation, I built what are called grouping identifiers for all residential properties, and for every transaction in the sales file. In the sales file, I use attributes at time of sale. In the inventory file, I use the current attributes. So group IDs provide a snapshot of a property, and what they do is to bring together the most important elements that affect value into one text identifier. So for Buncombe County, I built the group IDs using the last 5 digits of the census block group, and then the building type, quality of construction, the general time period in which the residence was built, the relative size of the residence, rating from smallest to largest, the condition of the residence, and I created a subgroup code that would allow us to identify properties that need some special consideration. For instance, a property that has a structural problem, or a property that maybe it's built over an underground stream, and when it rains, that's the only property on the block that gets a flooded basement. So what group IDs allow us to do is to designate properties as members of groups and to make decisions at the group level. So this is going to ensure that all properties in the group are treated equally. It allows us to have different methods, adjustment coefficients, and techniques for different groups of properties. We can keep aggregate or summary data for all of the groups, not just the properties, but the actual groups, and easily publish that data. We can compare sales to unsold properties both within groups and between groups to better understand representation. And using this method, I can precisely identify every property that is not represented by at least one sale or by a predetermined number of sales. And these are a great aid in the review of market values. So here are some high-level summary information about groups of single-family residences in Buncombe County. So there are almost 28,700 groups representing your 98,000 residential properties, and there are 15,800 sales for those properties, which is a representation percentage of 16.1%. So one of the interesting things to note is that there are only 4 groups with more than 100 accounts in them. And none of them are really large because altogether they only represent 503 accounts. But there are 100 sales within those groups, which is a 21% representation percentage. But the thing you really want to look at, and probably the biggest surprise, is that of your 28,000 groups, a little over 21,000 of them have no sales. And these represent 48,300 accounts, which is 49% of the inventory. And another thing that I found very interesting is that a total of only 4.5% of the properties are in condition that's noted as being below normal. That's fair, poor, or unsound. Now, I would suspect that there are actually many more of these out there in the county, but they just have not been identified. Counts to their group summaries, I can now identify every one of the 48,327 accounts that are not represented by at least one sale. So by summarizing these groups, we can directly compare sold to unsold properties within groups, and we can compare similar groups to one another. So in this report, these are 6 groups from Shiloh, Sweeten Creek area. And in each group, the top line represents the unsold inventory and the bottom line represents the sales. So sometimes the sales are also the same properties in the unsold inventory, but sometimes they may have sold as a member of the group, but may no longer be a member of that group. So if we look at this group, this is a group of 28 large 2-story residences in average quality that were built between 1965 and 1985 and are in average condition. They appear to be well represented by 8 sales. The range in both market value, $102,000 to $423,000, and market value per square foot, $61 a square foot to $252, appears to be pretty wide, and that suggests that there may be some flawed data within the group. But overall, the group appears to be slightly undervalued. The other 5 groups in the sample are all average quality ranch houses in the same census block group. So these are properties within the same neighborhood, but there are slight differences between them. These groups are all different in terms of size, age, and condition. So the difference in good versus normal condition is reflected in the higher values. If we see these 2 groups, the C22GO group, 26 properties, 7 sales, you can see they have higher values than the group below them, which are essentially the same ranch houses, same neighborhood, but they're in normal condition versus good condition. So you'd expect the good condition ones to be valued slightly higher, and they are. And if you look within the group, they're actually pretty close. Where the ones in good condition, the unsold properties are valued at about $212 a square foot, and they're selling for about $218 a square foot. The group below that appears like they may be slightly overvalued if you go by rate per square foot, but slightly undervalued if you just look at raw price. So if we compare these 2 groups, the difference is that the 11 properties that are represented by 4 sales are larger than the group with 26 properties that are represented by 7 sales. And we can see that the larger properties have slightly higher values, although they have lower rates per square foot. But the relationship in value between these 2 appears to be okay. Now you'll notice that here's a group of 11 houses for which there are no sales, but the values are in line with the good condition properties that are larger houses in the same condition, and also in houses that are normal instead of good condition that are in the same size. So they're valued less than the larger houses in good condition, and then they're valued more than the same size houses in the same condition. So there's a lot of power and using groups to understand representation and the relationships between sales and the unsold inventory. As a web resource, a homeowner can enter their address on a website and see all of the properties that are considered to be comparable to theirs. They can see the time-adjusted sales data for those properties and can compare their properties to properties in other similar groups. One of the things that was really stood out to me during the course of this study was the issues with the workforce capacity of the Buncombe County Assessor's Office. IAAO recommends a parcel to staff ratio of between 2,000 and 5,000 to 1, depending on how homogeneous the inventory is, the level of technology available to the department, the number of accounts in non-residential property classes. So with 133,000 parcels, the office should have somewhere between 26 and 66 employees. The Real Property Division currently has 25 on staff, with 1 vacant position in their workforce plan. This number includes the real property appraisers, analysts, GIS staff, and administrative personnel, but does not include 4 contract workers who provide general services not directly related to appraisal. The ratio of accounts to staff is approximately 5,300 to 1. And the high degree of technological capacity provides efficiencies that reduce the total number of recommended staff, but this is countered by the variety and complexity of the inventory and the sheer number of submarkets. So I can't make a recommendation as to what the right number of staff is, but it appears as though there are not enough people to support all of the workflows that the assessor's office needs to be doing. So I believe that the assessment office and the county managers should work together to arrive at a workforce plan that will realistically provide the assessment office with the capacity to best serve the constituents. County managers are encouraged to consider staff augmentation not as an expense, but as an investment in constituent services that pay significant dividends in both the short and long term. Even when assessments are based on objectively observed attributes of properties, using the most demographically agnostic processes available, it is possible for the biases of those who collect and enter the underlying data or who interact with the assessment subsystems to introduce bias into the process. To determine if bias is entering the process through the valuation subsystems, I reviewed workflows and documentation, interviewed employees and managers who work with each subsystem, and reviewed the data files. This work is very important. It goes beyond mere statistical evaluation, but actually starts to look at how people are doing the work and what is the work that they are doing. So these are the subsystems that I looked at and what I found. Data collection, which is the way that data is collected and entered into the system, and it is a common entry point for bias. The department relies on several methods of self-reporting by taxpayers, which allows homeowners to report or correct inaccurate property data. The assessment office has workflows that trigger field visits when a permit is approved or when a property is sold or transferred, when there is an inquiry, complaint, or appeal, or when there is a partial split or consolidation. And what this means is that they only visit a property when it's flagged by some activity. Examination of the distribution of condition codes among unsold properties shows that there's a large imbalance. The vast majority of properties are listed as in normal or better condition. Of the 98,000 properties, only 4,400, about 4.5%, are listed as being in less than normal condition. When I was driving the county, I took a list of all of the properties that were listed in poor or unsound condition. And as we drove, when we drove past one of them, I checked to see if they were actually in poor or unsound condition. And I found many errors. I found many that were listed as poor or unsound that had been renovated, rehabbed, or maybe even torn down. And we also drove past properties that were in poor or unsound condition, and I looked to see if those were on the list, and there were many that were not. So in reality, there are probably many more properties that are in fair or poor or unsound condition that have not been observed. and are not accurately listed and are being valued as average or better condition properties, and all such properties will be overvalued. We would expect to see greater concentrations of these properties in the disadvantaged neighborhoods. But we're going to see some of these inaccuracies in every neighborhood, and they're going to be really a public relations problem, because people that live in those neighborhoods will see that there are errors that aren't being addressed by the assessor's office. Sales validation consists of two parts: coding transactions as either valid or invalid, and capturing the characteristics of a property at the time that it was sold. The purpose of a robust sales validation process is to create a pool of sales that are good indicators of the value of similar properties. After all, that's what we do in mass appraisal. And this goes beyond a simple determination of a transaction status as arm's length. So sales validation should seek to eliminate sheriff sales, foreclosures, estate sales, bids, sales to predatory speculators, sales between related parties. But unfortunately, sales validation is a subjective process, and it's very susceptible to human bias. When I interviewed the Buncombe County validators, I found that what they are doing is validating sales to the arm's length standard. And this process should be changed to invalidate transactions that don't represent typical activities. Many counties that rely on the cost approach may not have created a sales file that meets the criteria stated above. But even if the sales approach is not the primary value of the driver of the valuation process, sales are going to be used to measure assessment performance. And ratio studies are easily distorted by including transactions where the attributes of the property at time of sale are different than attributes at time of valuation. So it is strongly recommended that a well-validated file of transactions that meets these criteria is created and used to evaluate assessment performance. So what constitutes a good sale? Well, whether we're conducting ratio studies or estimating values for unsold properties based on sales, the definition of a good sale must include, from the property's perspective, that it's exposed to an open market for a reasonable length of time, and that the consideration must be expressed in currency. In terms of the parties, both the buyer and the seller should be well informed, typically motivated, acting with self-interest. The buyer should be using typical financing, and the seller should be making no concessions. The parties should not be related, and neither party should be under duress. So the county should be striving to keep transactions that are good indicators of the present value of similar properties. And pretty much all other transactions should be disqualified. So neighborhood delineations and definitions. Neighborhoods should be areas within which parcels with similar characteristics will sell for similar prices. Now, it's not necessary for all properties within a neighborhood to be similar. Neighborhoods should be created that are agnostic to who lives in or owns the properties, and they should be frequently updated to reflect changes in the market. If you use this definition, there will be no poor neighborhoods or neighborhoods that are defined by race or ethnicity. So the Buncombe County office uses a system of over 2,600 custom-defined areas that they loosely term as neighborhoods. And these areas are drawn down to the parcel level as opposed to drawing the lines at the street level, so that properties that face one another across the street will usually be in the same neighborhood, and this is a good thing. This concept allows for a lot of precision in determining location. It also has the advantage of being easy to review and modify as the market changes. But with only 98,000 residential properties, the average number of properties in a neighborhood is just under 40. Some neighborhoods contain fewer than 10 properties, and this is simply too granular to provide for meaningful levels of activity in many neighborhoods. Most of the neighborhoods that I observed were not homogeneous and contained properties that varied in size, age, design, and quality, all right next to each other. But many of the neighborhoods that are defined try to create groups of comparable properties, and this is a task that is far better accomplished by using the attribute-defined groupings within neighborhoods that I demonstrated earlier. In the current system, whenever a new home is built on an existing vacant lot in the neighborhood, the comparability that was defined by the neighborhood no longer exists. The office is constantly carving out new neighborhoods within the existing schema. During my brief visit to Asheville, at least 3 new neighborhoods were created. And the office uses sales of vacant land within the defined neighborhoods to set land rates. Most of the neighborhoods do not have enough land sales to calculate land rates, and so these neighborhoods get combined with other similar neighborhoods to set land rates. But these combinations may not always be appropriate. I also found that the office uses only one set of definitions and one map layer for all classes of property. And this poses some problems, as the boundaries that define location are probably different for office buildings than for industrial properties or for apartments or for residential properties. So I think that they need to have different location boundaries for each class of property. Now I want to talk about your valuation process. So the path of equitable assessment starts with a process that's going to limit subjectivity and opportunities to introduce bias, but it's also going to require the use of methods and techniques that do not consider demographics in the determination of market values. Buncombe County's assessment process does not use demographic attributes or data at any point in the valuation process. Neither does the process rely on legacy information that may be subject to bias, such as redlining maps. The resulting process is resistant to systemic bias, although each valuation subsystem may be subject to the biases of the humans who interact with the system. I found that there is a general perception that the county uses sales in the valuation process that determines market values, but this is not actually the case. Sales are used in the ratio studies that compare prices to values, but they do not directly enter into the valuation process. So sales are a mirror that reflects value, but does not actually determine value. So let's look at the Buncombe County valuation process. It's important to consider how values are actually determined. So Buncombe County uses what's called a modified cost approach to estimate values. And in this approach, market value is defined, or it's equal to land value plus the price to build the building. And on the building side, they take off all the depreciation to the building from all costs. So first, let's look at the land side of that equation. The land value is going to be a function of the lot size measured in acres times the land rate, and that land rate is based on the average price of land sales within the neighborhood or within comparable neighborhoods. And from that, they calculate a neighborhood land factor. So that is derived from sales, but it's land sales, not sales of properties. And then they produce curve factors so that larger lots are not going to be at the same rate per acre as smaller lots. So they produce different land rates or different rates for different size lots. So you have some market activity or market derivation occurring in the calculation of the land factors and land rates and the curve factors. The side of the equation, they start by estimating the cost to replicate the building as new. And so they look at they multiply the building square footage times the rate per square foot to produce the building. They'll look at things like the number of baths times the rate per bathroom, garage square footage for the rate per square foot to build a garage, and so on and so forth. And all of these rates come from nationally compiled cost tables from the construction industry. So these are modified by a quality adjustment for the quality of construction in the building, and further modified by a depreciation factor, which tries to capture how much the building has depreciated through lack of maintenance. And then there's also a condition of property adjustment for the condition of the improvements. But all of these all of these factors are drawn from cost tables. None of them are derived from the market directly. So after they estimate the cost of the building, depreciated value of the building, they can further make a neighborhood adjustment based on sales data to all properties in the neighborhood. So the important points to consider here that sales only influence your process indirectly and only by making adjustments to all properties within the neighborhood, both on the land side and the building side, not to each property individually. So at the neighborhood level, values are based on central tendencies, with only lot size, building size, quality of construction, and condition of improvements offering degrees of freedom from the central tendency for specific properties. So one of the guiding principles of mass appraisal is that models have to do two things. They have to produce a strong central tendency, and they have to account for variance from the central tendency. So this method does a very good job producing strong central tendencies, but it's very limited in its ability to create variance or explain variance away from the central tendency. It's going to tend to undervalue the best properties in any neighborhood and overvalue the worst properties in any neighborhood. Most of the neighborhoods that I observed are not homogeneous. They're a mix of large and small, new and old, and various designs and styles. So adjustments that are made at the neighborhood level will tend to overgeneralize and introduce errors as properties are less like the typical property. So IAAO recommends using the sales approach for residential properties with regression models representing the best embodiment of that sales approach. So by way of contrast with the modified cost approach, let's look at how regression models work. So in a regression model, you take sales and you identify various attributes that are present in the sold property. So this is a simplified version. We're just looking at building size, lot size, garage, the overall design of the property, and the location. And what the model does is it determines how much each of those attributes contributes to price. And it develops a central tendency for a price for the most typical property, and then adjustment coefficients for every way that any given property is different than the typical property. So it then takes those constants and coefficients and applies them to all of the unsold properties to come up with values. So each attribute in the model creates more power to explain variance on a property by property basis. And also notice that all of the attributes in your current process are what's called intrinsic, which means that they exist within the boundaries of the parcels. There is nothing that explains key relationships between parcels, things like distance to parks, or water, or shopping. None of those things are part of the valuation process. If you were using regression models, those spatial attributes work like any other attribute, and this provides much greater power to explain differences in value between neighborhoods. So there are dramatic price increases in the post-COVID time. It's a global phenomenon. It's not just happening in Buncombe County. And many jurisdictions across the country have been faced with huge increases in price since 2020. And many jurisdictions who have done reappraisals have had to enact circuit breakers to provide tax relief for constituents facing property tax increases that could often exceed 50%. Buncombe County is going to see large increases in assessed values in many communities in the 2025 reappraisal. Rising prices have caused the median ratio to fall precipitously. Using recorded price against current values to measure the ratio yields a median of about 80%. Adjusting prices for time gives a more accurate median ratio of about 65%. So based on the time adjustment matrices that I developed for this report, rural communities could see increases of over 80% since 2020. Suburban communities are up about 65% in the same time period, and urban communities are up 56%. North Carolina law leaves very little room to provide tax relief for constituents in the ways that many other counties or jurisdictions have been able to provide such relief. So things like homestead exemptions or caps on tax increases, using split tax rates, so there's one rate for residential and another rate for non-residential. Other measures that have been taken elsewhere. So it's highly recommended that Buncombe County administrators consider tax relief measures for homeowners. But this will require new legislation to be written at the state level. So I'm recommending that that all of the large counties in North Carolina engage with the North Carolina state legislature to expand the options for tax relief for constituents. Now for my conclusions. After conducting this extensive body of work, I found no evidence of systemic racial or income bias in the performance statistics. Isolated indications of bias were found in favor of or against price classes or condition of improvements and property types, but nothing in terms of race or income. I found no evidence of political interference. Now, political interference is common in the assessment process, and where it exists, it's often a feature, it's not a bug. It's often found in the foundation of the legacy of practice. And examining the legacy of practice exposes the roots of such interference, which can then be identified through a variety of statistical processes. Allegations of bias in assessments frequently imply malfeasance on the part of the jurisdiction. So therefore, this statement is a very important element of my findings. I found no evidence of bias in the attitudes of the workforce. Bias is frequently found in the often unconscious attitudes of those who work in the system. Examination of workflows, data files, and interviews with the staff showed no causes for concern and no support at all for a bias allegation. The appraisal system is blind and fair and does not consider demographics in producing estimates of value. This does not imply that the process is perfect or without room for improvement. Bias, as such, is entering the valuation process through data collection, the valuation process itself, sales validation, and neighborhood definitions and delineations. Improvements are needed in those areas, and specific recommendations have been made in Section 17 of the report. Bias that I observed is not based on race or income, but it is evidence in terms of price points and condition of improvements. I found that the assessment office is understaffed. They are maximizing the use of technology, but the current level of staffing limits the scope of what the office can achieve and needs to be addressed. In my opinion, the practice of mass appraisal in Buncombe County is fair and not based biased in favor of or against any demographically identifiable group. Reports that have been published alleging or supporting allegations of bias suffer from the serious deficiencies enumerated in Section 9.1 of my report and in Appendix D, specific references to published reports, that I believe render those reports unreliable as credible sources of analysis or information. The perception of bias should be acknowledged and addressed, because I think this is very important. There is a perception of bias out there in the public. And this needs to be addressed through increased public outreach and education, and by encouraging constituents to engage with the assessment office with both general and specific questions or concern. Additional transparency regarding the valuation process is recommended. There are many general misconceptions surrounding the methods by which values are determined. The Buncombe County Assessment Office is very progressive and is interested in making improvements to the valuation process and its component subsystems. They have engaged my services to monitor progress through the 2025 reappraisal and beyond. The county can expect measurable improvement in the quality and equity of assessments. No evidence of systemic bias was found. This equity study resulted in 28 specific recommendations to improve assessment equity and quality in Buncombe County. These are introduced throughout the report and summarized in some detail in Section 17. I'll walk through them quickly here. In terms of the workforce, the recommendations were Increase the number of permanent appraisal staff to comply with IAAO guidelines. Create a customer service unit to handle complaints and inquiries. This will reduce some of the workload of the appraisers and free them up to do more higher level work. Create a 3-person modeling and analysis unit. Create a specialty unit for manufactured homes, modular homes, and unusual properties. And also to partner with local universities to create an internship program to provide short-term augmentation for the appraisal staff. In terms of data management, the recommendations were to identify entry-level, discretionary, and externally driven submarkets. To create an owner filter table to identify and possibly invalidate sales to entities that do not typically engage in transactions that represent market activity. To field check properties in at least the 8 census block groups that represent disadvantaged communities to reduce the number of properties that will be overvalued based on inaccurate condition codes. And to create a workflow to support the continued observation of properties that are in the cycle of decline. In terms of the subsystems, the recommendations were to create a process to identify transactions that involve out-of-market buyers. And everything that has an asterisk, these are things that the assessor's office has already begun to do. Identify out-of-county buyers for purposes of sales validation. Create a specialty role or unit for the valuation of luxury homes. Expand the sales validation unit to at least 2 full-time employees. And when conducting ratio studies, use only sales data that has been validated and ensures that the attributes of the property at the time of valuation are the same as the attributes that were present at the time of sale. Use regression models to isolate the effects of time in various submarkets and adjust all prices calibrated as of a common target date, and also to remove outliers. Make the classification of your rural, suburban, or urban development classes based on census block groups instead of communities. Increase the capacity in the assessor's office to allow for a relisting of attributes and periodic field inspections on a regular cycle. The last major relist in the county for the data in the county was almost 20 years ago, and this is a project, it's a big project, but it really needs to be done. Change the definition of neighborhoods and create a unique set of location definitions for each property class. In terms of training, the recommendation was to revise the definition of valid transactions to include only transactions that are indicators of the value of comparable properties. Recommendations for the valuation methods were: add sales regression modeling to the valuation process. Build and maintain machine learning models in-house. They're currently contracting with an outside vendor for a machine learning model, but they can have much more control of how that model works and what goes into it and understanding how it works if they actually build it and maintain it in-house. Using spatial attributes to capture key relationships between parcels and adding those spatial attributes to the valuation process. Other recommendations included creating informational video files and playing them on a loop in the public access areas of the assessor's office, and also making them available through the assessor's website. This will improve transparency and the public understanding of the entire assessment process. Incorporate the group summaries that I demonstrated earlier in this presentation into the market value review process and make them available as an online source for constituents. Improve tools for reviewing and revising values that are projected through the valuation process. And finally, I recommend that the county band together with other counties in North Carolina and work with the North Carolina State Legislature to expand the options for tax relief for constituents. Thank you for watching this video. I hope this presentation has been helpful. Please feel free to contact me if you have any comments or questions.